Good morning, everybody. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Yes, I changed the title of this talk. The novelist Abraham Rothberg wrote, "Fiction is a lie that tells the truth." This very same thing was said by my favorite existentialist, Albert Camus. I loved that snappy paradox that it put forward, so I decided that that would be the title, but it began to sour on me. For one thing, lies are morally problematic most of the time, especially given the certain turn of our politics. And they can be destructive. So I decided to shift when a friend of mine, Mary Kay Zaravalov, suggested one I liked better: fiction, imagining the truth. Now, Mary Kay is an author of 4 marvelous books. She's a skilled storyteller, as is Yelena Fedorov, the young narrator in Mary Kay's latest novel, American Ending. Through this story, there are lots of historical events. There's the Spanish flu epidemic, there's a 1908 mine disaster that was horrible, but Yelena is fiction. She's created, but she's realistic. According to the Kirkus Review, a whole world comes streaming through Yelena. The narrator's voice and her story is so unusually vivid that it feels like Zaravalov is channeling a real person. Through creativity, Mary Kay offers readers real insights into life, struggle, suffering, and perseverance through fiction. She imagines the truth. So today I'm going to begin by talking about storytelling. And then I'm going to move on to benefits of fiction, and I'm going to talk about 4 of them. The fact that it offers escapism, it helps you develop empathy, it allows you to practice for real life situations, and it helps build a more ethical world. Those are the 4 I'm going to focus on. So storytelling. Well, storytelling has bonded our species since before history. It happened around campfires, it was carved on rocks, tattooed onto skin. Sometimes it involved music and dance and costumes. It captured history and genealogy. It declared identity and social status. And it was essential to religious practice and education, as it is today. Storytelling is an aesthetic discipline that you can practice and perform. It can also help create stronger communities by bonding people together and working through conflicts through stories. Stories can heal. I mean, they're the fodder of psychotherapy. You tell your story on the couch. And stories also transmit the values and the mores of civilization and cultures. They arise in fairy tales, folk tales, fables, legends, myths. Now, Joseph Campbell, many of you might know his name. He was a comparative literature professor and an expert on myths. He collected a whole series of stories from around the world, and he analyzed how certain story arcs appeared all over the world, the same ones. Campbell suggested that their similarity arose from human nature and our collective unconscious. Now, a common narrative framework that Campbell offers is called the hero's journey. In it, a protagonist travels through 3 phases: the departure, the initiation, and the return. The departure begins with a hero living a normal life, and then circumstances change and they have to leave their comfort, and with the advice and support of a mentor or an elder, they set off. The initiation, which comprises most of the journey, involves challenges that have to be overcome through self-discovery and inner strength. The return involves a final test that usually pushes the protagonist to the limits, and then they're welcomed back home as a hero. Now, many turn to Campbell to learn how to write stories. In fact, I found one intriguing article with a transparent title: "Reading Joseph Campbell will help you become a better writer." That's clarity. That's a good part of writing, right? The author references Star Wars as an iconic example of the hero's journey. So I apologize if you don't know it, but Luke, after discovering that his family had been murdered, takes encouragement from Obi-Wan and takes a lightsaber and crosses over into a world of adventure. Luke learns how to use the Force in order to confront the evil Empire and succeeds in destroying the Death Star, and then he returns to the rebellion base to receive a medal as a hero. Now, a lot of writers agree that this story arc, along with lots of other story arcs, allow them to connect more effectively with the reader. Because it's hard to get attention of people. We're busy, we're distracted, we're bombarded by news and commercials and competing stories. So to get the story noticed by someone, you have to find a way into their brain. You need access. Now, David Eagleman, who writes for The Times, interestingly, used an analogy from Star Wars to make this point clear. He says the climactic scene where the Death Star is attacked, first of all, the Death Star seems nearly impenetrable. Like most of us walking through the world too bombarded by other things, we're just getting our tasks done. The only way for Luke to destroy the Death Star is to find a hole in the system, a way inside to the center. Now, Luke knows that there's a small pathway from the surface into the core, and his proton torpedo finds its way there, and victory is assured that way. But he had to find a way in. Now, Eagleman is a bit of an extended metaphor, but Eagleman says that to get into the minds and hearts of readers, writers need to find that particular pathway. And for humans, Eagleman says, the whole is story-shaped. In other words, that's how you get to people, through stories. That's the little passageway inside. And that's why, Eagleman says, religions sell themselves using stories, generally. Relatable tales is what he says. He says, quote, they are stories about burning bushes, whales, sons, lovers, betrayals, and rivalries. And they share a lot of similar archetypes and motifs and patterns. Borrowing familiar patterns can help a writer connect with a reader. But good fiction is obviously more than cutting and pasting from other stories. It requires creative imagination, which is different than receptive imagination. Receptive imagination is when you take something in and you can create the story in your mind. So if you read and watch, you are creative. It's a creativity of taking the words and images and creating the story. But creative imagination is about the creation of stories. How do you make them? Now, Cillian Murphy, who's an actor you probably now know, starred in Oppenheimer, says that this type of creative imagination runs through his native Ireland. And he cites the Irish poets and novelists and storytellers as his inspiration as an actor. When he read the script about Robert Oppenheimer, which was based on the book by Kai Bird and Martin Sherwin titled Prometheus, and if you haven't read it, it's a brilliant book, he was sold. He said, I got to do this. And one reason was he found this person so full of contradictions that intrigued him. Now, he was a thin guy, Cillian Murphy. He lost 30 pounds because he wanted to literally embody Oppenheimer. And it was an agonizing process for him. It's one reason why he won the Academy Award is the amount of sacrifice he put in. But to harness this inner storyteller as an actor, see, this is the interesting thing. I said, oh, it's not fiction, but it is, because he is not Oppenheimer. He's getting you to believe he's Oppenheimer. So that's a form of fiction. Well, he studied Oppenheimer's mannerisms, his speech, how he stood and he walked. Actors have to do more than just copy the real. They have to convince you that they are the person they are portraying. So I think that's a type of fiction. Now, good fiction relies on realism, like a good actor uses realism to convince you that he's the person. Toni Morrison, the novelist, talked about adding to the real. She learned to write both what she called the actual and the possible, and putting them together. It allowed her to find and give voice to forgotten and unsayable truths she talked about the world. She said, to express some deep truth, only imagination can help me. That was Morrison. Now, I want to turn now to these 4 benefits I was talking about. It can be problem-solving tool, where you can see conflicts you might have in real life and figure out how you would approach them. It can teach you empathy. It can encourage us to build justice, and it can help us escape into another world. I think something particularly useful these days after the election. I'm doing a lot of escapism. But I do think escapism gets a bad rap. Maybe it's because we're fearful that we're going to go so far down that rabbit hole we'll never come back. That's possible. But escapism, depending on its form, can be a very healthy response to distress. Writer-director Maria Heller put it this way. She said, sometimes we need pure relief. Sometimes we need pure escapism. Sometimes we need major reflection on some aspect of our collective unconscious. Sometimes we need to turn inward and shut out the world. So diving into a book or a film can offer us this relief and escape and time to reflect on what's under the surface. Jonathan Gottschall, who wrote a book called The Storytelling Animal, speaks about how much time we spend in fictional worlds of novels and dreams and daydreams and films. He actually argues that storytelling isn't just a curious part of our genetic makeup, but an essential part of our nature. After all, he claims that we spend more time in fantasy worlds than in the real world. Wow. And then I began to think about it. You add up all those things, dreams, daydreams, novels, films. I daydream half the day. Gottschall says that Neverland is our evolutionary niche. It's our special habitat. It's where we live as humans. So escapism does more than just allow us to escape. It can rejuvenate us. It can be a process of the outside world, trying to figure out how things are happening. A young author named Andrea Stewart, I like this. She said, by its definition, escapism means diverting your mind from unpleasant realities, but just like daydreams, they take us away from the day. Fantasy can be a means through which we process events. So we can be doing real work with this sort of escapism. She says that escapism disarms us, it draws us in, it lowers our defenses. It helps us process things we might otherwise shy away from or find too difficult to face head on. Daydreaming can help a person solve pressing dilemmas or provide a safe space to tackle difficult problems. When we learn things we don't intend to while daydreaming, I think that's true sometimes too. Things will come to us that we never would have thought of. We escape reading what is escapist reading except a structured collective daydream? I liked how she framed that. Now, how many of you know Neil Gaiman? He's all over the internet. He teaches writing, he's an author. But he also said fiction is a lie that tells the truth, a third person. That's why he has such a good title. But anyway, he understood that imagination can help us focus on the real world. He said, we all have an obligation to daydream. We all have an obligation to imagine. It is easy to pretend that nobody can change anything, that society is huge and the individual is less than nothing. But the truth is that individuals make the future. And they do it by imagining that things can be different. I'm going to come back to that at the end. So imagined stories can give us hope that we can change the world. Gaiman says in his comic book, The Sandman, things need not have happened to be true. Tales and dreams are the shadow truths that will endure when mere facts and dusts and ashes are forgotten. Now, many of these tales come out around holiday times. I think that's something about the cycle of our lives. And I loved growing up lots of stories like The Christmas Carol or The Gift of Magi by O. Henry, or favorite silly film, The Christmas Story. At last year's winter solstice, I read you a story, the first time I had read it, Jeanette Winterson's A Christmas Cracker, about a dog and a kid. It transported me into this London fundraiser for an orphanage. Winterson put it this way. She said, books and doors are the same thing. You open them and you go through into another world. I love that. And where do you end up? A faraway land? The good old days of our place here? or maybe even a world that is yet to be. But it feels good and connected to the world around us that makes fiction work quite often. It's not a completely made-up world. Wilkinson didn't make up this orphanage. There were many things about it that were true. And that's even the case with science fiction, which is often as far away from reality. But what makes science fiction believable is it is connected. There are lots of scientific truths in a lot of science fiction. And that's what makes it so alluring. It contains truth. Toni Morrison, when she wrote Beloved, made it real. That's why it impacted us so much. I mean, it was based on a real person, Margaret Garner, who Morrison read about in an article from 1856. And it's a horrible story. It was about how Garner escaped from slavery, and in order, as she was about to be recaptured with her daughter, in order to keep her daughter from being enslaved, she killed her. Heartbreaking story. Morrison did a lot of research about America in the middle of the 19th century, about where Garner lived, about the circumstances of his life, but she did not read anything else about Garner herself. Morrison said, "I refused to find out anything else about Margaret Garner. I really wanted to invent her life." So every writer needs to know when to break or how they're going to break from reality. Maybe escapism requires some of the real world, but not too much. Balance. And actors have to balance that same creative embodiment and the real world. They mix reality and creativity. Now, Cillian Murphy, when he played Oppenheimer, said he had to choose just the right elements of what parts of the personality, what parts of the story was he going to embody. Picking the right elements lays an actor to bring a character to life. And that's really leads into my next topic, which is empathy. How does literature help us develop empathy? I empathized with Cillian's Oppenheimer because he embodied contradictions that are so human and universal. He wanted to do good, while at the same time he knew he helped create the most deadly weapon in the world. There was a 60 Minutes interview that I found fascinating, in which Scott Pelley, the host, commented on how internal division was portrayed by Murphy. It was when Oppenheimer was speaking to the assembled Los Alamos crew right after the first bomb was dropped. Pelley says that Murphy, quote, somehow welds together the concept of being proud of what they did and regretting it very deeply all at the same time. I've watched that scene now about 6 times since reading that, and it's amazing. Murphy captures that really powerful contradiction that Oppenheimer brought into us, and he put it up on the screen for us to see. And it's a big reason, again, why he won the award. We felt this anguish. Stories can bring us into the ups and downs and challenges and perseverance of individuals, and it's really good for young people to learn about life that way, because a real-life crisis, a real-life argument can be terrifying for a child. But if they read about it in the book, they can always, when it gets too intense, close it, put it away. There's some distance there. But it's not wise to take all of the rough edges out of literature for children. Jane Addams remembers growing up being shielded by adults who didn't want her to see the ugly part of life, and she was angry at that because she said she wanted to, and other kids wanted to, eat their bread with tears. One of my favorite quotes, eat their bread with tears, have their daily life mixed in with the sadness of the world. I talked a little bit about ethical culture leader Percival Chubb a couple of weeks ago, and he was an educator. And he made the same point in a New York Times article from 1897. He said, the way to make literature morally influential with children is to avoid its goody-goody types. I didn't realize goody-goody was a literature term. I guess it was. Goody-goody types might work for what Chubb calls the butterfly self, or the transparent self, the more superficial. But he says the deeper self requires heartier fare. Chubb insisted that young readers will grow not through the intellect, but through the heart and the imagination. In fact, he said that teaching English is harder than math and science because of that. He wrote, "What makes literature the most difficult of all subjects to teach is the fact that it has to deal with the heart rather than the intellect." Well, given all the complex elements of real human relationships, children might find it easier to learn empathy through fiction. When you have a history with someone, there are a lot of complicated elements, and it might be harder to actually feel for them. They're in your life as a relationship, so you might be judging rather than understanding them. It can be hard to get inside the perspective of somebody in our life. One researcher said that interpersonal meaning can more easily arise from within when we're not judging the character, so we can connect with them more easily. I instantly connect with any movie that gets me going. Like Oppenheimer, I felt like I could see through his eyes. A third benefit of fiction is it can help us deal with the challenges in life. Jonathan Gottschall again makes the case. He says in fiction and daydream and nightmares helps us understand how to work through conflicts. He says that novels are usually, quote, problem stories. He said almost every novel there's a problem that needs to be solved. And reading it lets us rehearse in case that same problem comes up. There might even be an evolutionary impact. The philosopher Karl Popper wrote that we use fiction as a way to simulate the future, which allows, quote, our hypotheses to die in our stead. Got that? So instead of us trying out everything, is this going to work? Is this going to work? That could be very dangerous. We think it through in stories. We don't want to do the fatal game of testing everything. So the stories act as like flight simulators, which allow us to practice before we actually pilot a plane. Stories can prepare us for bigger issues like death and dying, which is never easy. Sometimes we shy away from it in our lives. If we're transparent about it, we don't necessarily go to people. I mean, I have all the respect in the world for hospice workers and nurses who are at the bedside of dying people all the time. I don't know if I could do that as a profession. It is challenging. So to educate myself, I read books which have stories about it. Tuesdays with Morries, or Being Mortal by Atul Gawande. They're full of stories, human stories about life and death that help prepare you for this existential reality. They can also help us deal with broader social calamities, like an election that ushers in regressive worldviews and policies. Gottschall talks about the fact that a lot of them are so full of challenges, these books, that he calls these dystopias horrorscapes rather than landscapes. They're so full of these problems. They bubble with trouble, he said. Now, trouble, he says, is the universal grammar of stories. And these stories can, again, help us prepare. So recently, we've heard a lot. About the last 8 years, I think, I've been reading about Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale, one of our favorite books here, I think. It depicts America full of misogyny and fascist characteristics. And we've seen folks dressing up in Halloween costumes in their Handmaid's Tale costumes for years. And I wonder whether Atwood was giving us a warning, maybe, right? Did she help us prepare for Project 2025? Fiction is basically a way to predict future challenges. George Orwell, 1984, warned us of mass surveillance, right? From cameras on every corner to tracking us on our cell phones, something we did earlier today. Mary Shelley, Frankenstein. It seemed pretty weird at the time, but now we replace our body parts, we have fake parts, we have genetic engineering. It's no longer pure fiction. I was even told recently that early cell phones were made to look like the communicators in Star Trek Enterprise. So I wonder what writers right now are telling us about what's going to happen in the future. So I'm not going to necessarily say that they are fortune tellers. I don't believe in that. But I do think that they might be the writers and critics who prophesize with their pen, telling us what's going to happen, like Bob Dylan told us. All right, the final benefit of fiction, I think, is the fact that it can bring out our ethical best, and it can help us build justice in the world. It's very influential in children's fiction. It often offers this advice, ethical advice. In so many religions, they use stories, as I said before. Gottschall talked about the fact that these problem stories often have strong moral underpinnings, not just about fixing your faucet. They can show both positive and negative examples very powerfully, and it's one reason why schools and libraries have become battlefields. People realize the power of stories. Percival Chubb, though, said, don't take all the dark stuff out for the kids. He said, there is no real danger in the introduction of children to the higher order of literature in which the dark as well as the light side of life is shown. And I mean, there are some parts of Shakespeare that are as dark as can be, betrayal and death and suicide, but they teach incredible things. So fear about this power of books is something that I think we need to put against the fact that usually it helps us all grow. Chubb again wrote, the business of the educator is to feed the abiding, deeper, greater self, that it will become easily the master over the other transient self. That's how Chubb insisted you, quote, you come to love all the things which are honorable and intrinsically lovable. In other words, it helps bring out our best. Certainly, writers influence history, exposing ugly things and uplifting the good. The arc of the universe has been bent towards justice thanks to a lot of writers. Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe helped bring in the Civil War that eventually ended slavery. Most of you probably know the story of when Lincoln met Stowe. He said, oh, you are the little lady who helped start this great war. Gave her that credit. Upton Sinclair in 1906 wrote a novel called The Jungle, and it was about the horrible meatpacking industry. It turned the stomachs of consumers and led Congress to pass the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act. So we all ate a little more safely this Thanksgiving. It also exposes poverty for people who can't eat because they are poor. John Steinbeck, The Grapes of Wrath, or Mice and Men. From Oklahoma to California, his characters are portrayed with dignity, which allowed people to connect with them during the Depression, because they could not realize the American dream. And Steinbeck brought the plight of the poor to America, into the public eye. In fact, the Wisconsin Senator Bob La Follette held hearings on migrant farm worker poverty during the Depression and advocated for federal labor rights going to agricultural workers. So books can have real effects. And that's the hope of almost any writer, I believe, is to try to make the world a better place. Not by ignoring the ugly parts, but by imagining a way to do better. Toni Morrison strove to imagine this. She believed that the practice of justice is tied to the practice of imagination. She said, if you can't imagine a better world, how are you going to build one? Professor Carrie Hazlett Brooks emphasized how Morrison tried to, quote, imagine what is possible for ourselves in the world. When we dream, when we care for and foster our imaginations as individuals and communities, when we hold the possible alongside the actual, then we have the power to reimagine and remake the world together. Octavia Butler did that too. Great science fiction writer. In fact, she has an entire group of black science fiction writers that follow her called Octavia's Brood. There's a podcast by that name. She talks about how the fact that, in fact, the world was so screwed up that you had to have really radical imagination to try to look for a better world. She said that testing ground for idealized states and radically different realities lives in science fiction. In one book by Adrian Brown and Walida Imarisha called Octavia's Brood, Imarisha explained in a recent interview that anytime we try to envision a different world without poverty, prisons, capitalism, and war, we are engaging in science fiction. When we can dream those realities together, that's when we can begin to build them right here and now. So, to conclude, look what fiction does for us. It can help us empathize, practice for challenges in the real world. It can help us problem solve, develop empathy, and make the world better. My friend Mary Kay's novels captivate because they tell good stories. That's how you get inside. They can help us escape and care for each other and prepare for challenges and build justice. And they do it better when the characters are real. And that means they are not consistent. They have conflicts and paradoxes. Many of them are about pride and regret, joy and shame, good and bad. And all of those are a part of all of us. In the Washington Post, Mary Kay spoke about her family's journey from Russia to America. She explained, "I've been hearing these stories my whole life, but the impetus that I grew up with was to push that aside, to be American. When you come from illiterate, poverty-stricken stock, you're not necessarily raised to be proud of that, to want to tell that story and spread it around. And yet, I keep meeting people who are being told the story of their family at someone's deathbed. Their relatives could take that secret to the grave, but before they die, they want to tell their story. So there's both pride and shame in it, and that makes for a good novel, Pride and Shame. I would add in good and bad, and regret and hope, and may we acknowledge that as we tell our stories. It connects the real human with the fiction, with the future." Thank you very much.